Chapter 36, Wedding Tents. Architecture, Part 2, Wedding Tents. The analogy of building a house and finding a wife is quite appropriate because for most of history, the two were deeply connected. Marriage is the ultimate telos behind the construction of every structure, from the first tent to the New Jerusalem. In practical terms, it's still what drives the construction of new buildings. Not all buildings are directly related to marriage, but when marriages end, civilization collapses, including the construction industry. Footnote. Some might object that procreation can occur outside of marriage. That is true, but marriage is a union based on the voluntary participation of man and woman. If procreation only occurs in situations other than something resembling marriage, the humans being bred have been reduced to chattel, and civilization is already ended. End note. This is why the construction methods of the pyramids, though they have endured, remain a mystery. At some point, those who knew their secrets either stopped getting married and having children, or they abandoned their knowledge and practice to redirect towards survival. The most enduring structures are made to house the growing human population. While churches and cathedrals are typically the places where marriages occur, they have their roots in human habitations. The tabernacle was the house of the Lord, and it came into existence at the same time the Lord crafted his people, Israel. The nation of Israel is recognized as being formed after the Exodus, but this reveals the same bridal imagery we see in the early chapters of Genesis. Just as Eve is pulled out of the parted side of Adam, Israel is removed through the parting waters of the Red Sea. The sons of Jacob, the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham, is born again out of the waters of Egypt. Over the course of its history, Israel takes turns as enacting the roles of both bride and groom, its kings and prophets as husbands. When Israel has a king, he is often wedded to a foreigner, something only forbidden to the priests, as a symbol of God's plan to unite all nations. While other times she is a harlot, the unfaithful wife who has abandoned her faithful groom for the gods of foreign kings. But when this nation is formed, their husbands instruct them in creating a marriage tent as a house of worship. When we remove the blinders of sacred tradition, we can begin to see the domestic realities of the tabernacle structure and elements. The sacrifices that occur outside the tents happen in the same place as the Passover, on the threshold of a dwelling place where all may enjoy the feast. Inside, a place where husband and wife, God and priest, meet and dine together. The light of the oil lamps illuminates the table of showbread, the humblest nourishment, but a feast when eaten in the presence of the beloved. The altar of incense creates an environment of mystery. The sweet-smelling smoke fills the space, obscuring the appearance of the beloved, feminine and Irenic in source, masculine and agentic in enjoyment and consumption. Finally, when the time is right, the high priest enters the most holy chamber. Israel and God unite on the Day of Atonement. The two are at one flesh in two bodies, carnal and incorporeal. This symbolism reflects a sort of pagan aesthetic that has been scrubbed from our modern marriages and churches. On one hand, the desire to elevate the sacredness of marriage is admirable, and when people seek to get married in a church or cathedral, they are participating in the tradition of ages. They are connecting themselves with every other couple that has begun their life together in that particular building and in the churches everywhere. But there's a disconnect with what we experience in those spaces. The ancient cathedral is better than the modern church in most respects, except that the tuxedos and satin gowns become even more anachronistic. The foreigner has an advantage here, as the exotic nature of traditional dress helps to transpose the event into slightly more mysterious territory. The problem is that the pagans were right in many ways about these ancient customs, but wherever they shared a similar understanding with the ancient Hebrews, we have thrown the biblical baby out with the dirty pagan bathwater. Dirt is one aspect of that whole ancient aesthetic. You can't escape the stuff. It's used by God to make men, and then men use it to make bricks and cities. But it's also the place where grain came from. Men used plows to dig furrows in the earth and scattered their seeds within. Seed, of course, is a word with a dual meaning. In Greek, sperma, and it means both the grain of a plant and the male sexual deposit. This is the area where the pagans got stuck, and the Christians decided to just move on. A survey of ancient myths would tell you there's no greater substance than the semen of divinities. The Egyptians believed all of creation resulted from the wedding of the hand and penis of the masturbating god Atum. Many more stories give the gods the supernatural ability to impregnate any living creature, regardless of sex or species. Zeus was especially notorious for making his way around the animal kingdom. Of course, these things form the basis of the perversions that make up the occult, the progression of which Mark Studdock imagines with banal predictability upon wrestling with the objective realm. Quote, the eating of abominable food, the dabbling in dirt and blood, the ritual performances of calculated obscenities. But the reason why it's always dirt, blood, food, drink, and sex is because there is real power in these elemental forces. I am not advocating for the elimination of church weddings, but it's all these elements which have been stripped from the ritual, replaced with sanitized symbols generations removed from the real stuff of life. Working the soil was analogous to sex, and it was done in anticipation of an act of consummation. Whether to earn money or for subsistence, agriculture developed in cultures aimed at uniting couples in matrimony and producing new life. When the fog of modernity is scrubbed from the translation of our texts, we see ancient Noah planting a vineyard to fortify himself for the consummation of a wedding night. Footnote. I've done extensive research on the story of Genesis 9, and my conclusion is that the wives of Noah and his sons were likely brought to the ark, escorting the 7 pairs of clean domestic animals, just before the deluge began. The mother of Noah's sons is no longer the wife of Noah at this point. Likely, she had been stolen or deceased. End footnote. The miracle at the wedding in Cana tells a similar tale. If they run out of wine, the marriage will not go right. The ancient symbolic connection between the marriage and the home has been preserved in the Jewish tradition in the use of the Chuppah. The Chuppah is representative of the groom's home, and specifically the bridal chamber. The weddings of Isaac and Jacob consist of nothing more than entry into a tent. First, a literal entry into the physical tent, followed by the metaphorical entry in the act of consummation. The chuppah was originally a true residence, whether it consisted of a tent, a new home, or an addition built onto the house of the groom's father. The prerequisite for taking a wife was the expansion or creation of a new domestic arena in preparation of the bride's arrival or the inheritance of the estate. The symbolic chuppah usually consists of 4 wooden poles supporting a roof tapestry. In modern contexts, it is often the centerpiece under which the entire ceremony takes place, but it can consist of nothing more than a prayer shawl, the talit, held on poles by 4 friends. A modern wedding may take place outside in a rented hall, church, or synagogue, but the wedding tent must be present within the greater space. No Jewish wedding is complete until the bride and groom are united beneath the chuppah. And this same symbol is then used to mock kings, such as when Absalom cuckolds his father David. They pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. 2 Samuel 16:22. Whether symbolic chuppahs were in use at this time is not known, but this passage hints at a similar structure. To make sure it was known that the deed was done, the sides of the tent were likely left open, yet the tent itself was still significant as a symbol. This betrayal was not about lust, but about being united in matrimony to members of his father's harem. Absalom's entrance into the tent of his father was just as significant as a conquering king entering the gates of a fallen city. This was a unique circumstance, as the Torah's literal prohibitions on sexual immorality were written as commands not to uncover the nakedness of various close relatives, all of whom would be present at a wedding feast. The proof that the deed was done, and that it was the first time for the woman, was given to the parents of the bride in the form of a blood-stained sheet. While having a wedding required the construction of a tent, preparation for marriage was contingent on securing a housing arrangement that was a bit more permanent, but perhaps just a bit more. The tabernacle was a two-chamber tent, and it's likely that this sort of dwelling was what is implied in the wedding of Isaac and Rebekah. Then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Genesis 24:67. The tent of the matriarch or patriarch would have enough space to allow for hospitality towards visitors, without inviting everyone into the place of privacy where a married couple slept. A quality tent was something designed to last through generations, and was a significant inheritance, though perhaps parts of it required repair and replacement. In the fashion of the ship of Theseus, they could last quite a long time. That is also the case of the tabernacle, which provided a place for the Ark of the Covenant to reside in some form or fashion from the time of Moses to the reign of King Solomon, a span of roughly 500 years. In that time, it served as more than just a sacred space, as it was the place where the child Samuel slept at night, 1 Samuel 3:3. Later on, when David is fleeing from Saul, he receives the bread of presence from the tabernacle, 1 Samuel 21:1-6. When the Pharisees confront Jesus and his disciples for plucking grain on the Sabbath, he reminds them of this story in Matthew 12:1-8. If we ask, why did God command that each day fresh bread be baked and replaced in the tabernacle, could it be that the sacred ritual was created for the day when the fugitive David would be hungry? It's not a stretch when the king declares that bread given to the least of men, it is received as a gift to God. We see that in the house of God, the mundane is not excluded for the sake of the sacred. As Jesus speaks of the Sabbath, the tabernacle is created for man, not man for the tabernacle. Yet God does instruct Bezalel and Aholiab to adorn the tabernacle and to make the items beautiful. And this is perhaps further evidence that the telos of this construction points towards marriage. The use of tents outside weddings is most commonly seen on the battlefield. These are designed to be put up with speed and to provide shelter from the elements. An army tent is no frills. That's not the case with the tabernacle. The adornment provides visual reminders of Eden, the first marriage, and the promise of future paradise. Solomon's temple takes this to another step. The imagery present in the temple is also found all over the Song of Solomon, the poetic key to Solomon's visual theology. Joshua Butler notes that the imagery in the Song of Songs is metaphorical of a woman, but is full of literal descriptions of the physical land of Israel. Footnote from his book, Beautiful Union. Are the hills and mountains representing the curves of a woman's body? Or are the amorous allusions designed to stir our love for the land? The answer is yes, and both. The pillars outside the temple are crowned with lilies, encircled with a network of pomegranates, and are synonymous with the lily of the valley in his psalm, surrounded by thorns, the bride in need of rescue. Though Solomon's own love of women became his undoing, his actions give us great insight into the way this wisest of kings understood the nature of Scripture and prophecy. It's a symbol of the Messiah, uniting all the nations of the world in marriage. My personal belief, supported by the assumption of Solomonic authorship of Ecclesiastes, is that Solomon was trying to provide both a vivid symbol of God's plan for the nations and a cautionary tale against other kings who would attempt to follow in his footsteps. Combined with the construction of his forest palace, Solomon recreates urban environments that reflect geographic locales of great significance. Mountains and valleys, gardens and forests each represent different relationships between heaven and earth and between God and man. These public structures added complexity to the lives of the Israelites. They were no longer the simple tent-dwelling people of the desert, but inhabitants of towns and cities with capitals, kings, and priests. The complexity of these new structures did not negate the symbolism of the prior structures, but rather expanded it. The 12 sons of Israel were wed to their 12 brides. The 12 tribes were wed to certain portions of the land. The semi-porous nature of borders allowed strangers to become friends, while the strong walls of cities provided the separation and privacy to delineate the family on the inside from the foreigners without. Why we build what we build. It only takes a bit of imagination to view all the customs and practices described in the Bible as organic developments based on the simple concepts of marriage. Marriage is the thing that turns strangers into families. It's vital to any future vision of greater peace. We can see how a civilization's architecture develops from this basic concept. The locations of a permanent or semi-nomadic culture are first determined by sources of water. The more permanent the water supply, the more stable the civilization. This is why the first great civilizations developed along riverbanks. But the pattern follows smaller cultures as well. In the Bible, the place to meet a spouse is at a well. Wells and oases then become the places where permanent settlements began. Individual tents or homes are first united around some sort of altar. Though we tend to think of these places as sacred and religious sites, their basic utility was a place to slaughter and cook wild game and livestock. These sacrifices were almost entirely consumed by the people involved. Meat was highly nutritious, but also perishable. So when a larger animal was killed, it made sense to feed as many people as possible. This created a quid pro quo amongst the various herdsmen and hunters, but it also did something more. We don't need to know how much mystical significance was placed on the consumption of flesh, but there was an understanding that whenever a meal is shared, some essence of the creature resides in everyone who participates. This binds the community together. Footnote. These practices can really go off the rails when humans are killed due to belief in scapegoat principles. People are united in a shared act of violence. This often leads to cannibalism. It's a community of warped purpose, but the ties that bind them together are very strong. End footnote. These patterns make any large gatherings ideal times to sacrifice animals, and such gatherings occurred naturally when couples were wed or children were born. Festivals of harvest made sense due to the abundance of resources, and so it often became customary to hold weddings at these times of year. The structures built in larger cities would reflect further development and sophistication of the same principles. In areas of stable but limited resources, protecting the inhabitants and their food became necessary. City walls extended the boundary of the community, adding another layer of division between friend and foe. What we build reveals what is precious to us, and walls are designed to protect the weak from the strong, mainly women and children, but they were also places where flocks could be gathered during times of conflict. Cities under siege are like survival arcs. Culture retracts into a seed form until it is safe to send out roots and branches. The problem with walled cities was that they put a hard cap on the population. When the population expanded to require more walled cities, there was no way to keep them united in purpose or relationship. This resulted in conflict and antagonism. Resolution came in the form of marriage, either through the forceful capture of the king's wives in the manner of Absalom, or through a merger of people groups, such as Shechem proposes to Jacob in Genesis 34. When the city-states in a region become sufficiently homogeneous in language and culture, something akin to a nation was born. Cultures that developed along rivers flourished through the development of agriculture. These cultures survived through an abundance of food, so much so that creative methods of preservation and storage were developed through necessities. The seasonal flooding of rivers required a different rhythm of life than the pastoral cultures. The creation of irrigation canals and granaries were major architectural developments, allowing for the maximum yields to be captured and preserved in each harvest. Along with fermentation, these developments led to the first truly wealthy cultures. The story of Joseph in the latter chapters of Genesis gives us insight into how these developments could best be used. Putting aside the supernatural revelation of the coming 7 years of abundance and subsequent famine, the principles show a wise use of the resources available in those times. Joseph protected the abundance of grain in walled cities, and when the famine strikes, he distributes the preserved grain from the granaries within those cities. Genesis 41, 48, and 56. His frugality and austerity enables the survival of the Egyptians and their neighbors. The more detailed account given in Genesis 47 describes the people's willful surrender of their land in exchange for survival. While many people chafe at the scenario described, it gives us a helpful insight into the nature of servitude in the ancient world. This voluntary decision to opt into something like serfdom was an agreeable exchange for people who did not have the resources to survive on their own. It's a development more along the lines of national citizenship than the chattel slavery of the New World. When things start to go wrong. The increase of food and stability provided by these developments first led to great population growth, but eventually these ancient cultures all ended in collapse. What went wrong? The architecture tells the story. The original forms of worship and sacrifice were always done for the benefit of those participating. The bit of drink poured out on the ground or the fat burnt on the altar was a recognition that the people making the offering had been blessed, but the blessing itself was the meal. As human ingenuity caused exponential growth in the blessings of the harvest, cities, kings, and priests supplanted the gods as the source from whom the blessings flowed. The landscape of antiquity is littered with massive monuments dedicated to the religious customs of their civilizations. Commonly taking the form of pyramids and ziggurats, these structures are located throughout the world, with many only recently being discovered. Dense tropical forests have hidden massive ruins in Asia and South America, while layers of sediment have obscured the man-made nature of many mountains in Europe and other parts of the world. The jarring disconnect between the complexity and ingenuity of these massive cities and temples and the primitive natives that currently inhabit the lands have led to numerous theories about the how and why of their construction. Were extraterrestrial aliens involved? Did these people achieve even more sophisticated technologies than our own, harnessing mysterious forms of electrical energy? Or were their origins supernatural in nature, as described in ancient myths? The events of recent history give us a far more sober answers to these questions. The 20th century produced a massive number of useless monuments that now litter the landscape of many nations on all major continents. These buildings were not dedicated to gods, but to dictators and leaders of ideological movements. The works of Hitler have been torn down, but those commissioned and dedicated to Lenin and Stalin are simply abandoned and unused. Massive resources are dedicated to maintaining the facade of central power in the capital cities of nations like North Korea, while the citizens in the countryside harvest their own excrement to provide food fertilizer for the state-run farms. Power and control are not the only aspects of culture prone to such corruption. Decadence and pleasure can do the same. The ruins of Rome are littered with amphitheaters, colosseums, and chariot racetracks, the evidence of a wealthy culture oversaturated with entertainment, while many of the temples of Greece were devoted to prostitution. As with the builders of the pyramids and other monuments of ancient Egypt, these ancient cultures ceased to exist, either because they abandoned the practices of rearing children, or the people walked away from their urban excess. Mel Gibson's 2006 film Apocalypto provides a vivid example of the foolishness that leads to civilizational collapse. The film is not a perfect historical representation of one particular place or event, but it accurately captures the spirit of brutality that results when cultures warp the telos of humanity. The enslaved forest dwellers arrive on the outskirts of a great city, where they encounter plague-stricken villages and failing crops. The Central Powers have doubled down on the construction of massive temples as the remedy to what they believe is a spiritual crisis. This is portrayed through the depiction of young, healthy men enslaved to harvest limestone and other resources in dangerous conditions detrimental to their health. Within the boundaries of the city, many wealthy elites are shown engaging in trade, eating fruit, and laughing with their friends. The female captives are brought to the market, human chattel sold for domestic labor and the sexual gratification of their new owners. The men, young and strong hunters from another clan, will be used for a task even less useful than temple construction. They are quickly prepared and brought to the top of the ziggurat to await their death. The priests then cycle through the line of young men, removing their still beating hearts and showing it to the victim for the last few seconds of life before they are decapitated and their corpse falls down the steps to join countless others in a disease-ridden heap. As one priest shouts messages about the need to appease the gods, another inhales the fumes from the burning hearts, muttering nonsense words from deep within a psychedelic trance. The king and queen look on, their placid faces painted with occasional signs of boredom, while their fat son takes visible delight in the gore. The archaeological evidence tells us that scenes such as these were far from rare. The Aztecs, Maya, and other cultures sacrificed people in the tens of thousands at regular intervals throughout the calendar year. The stories scream out through history by the architecture of the buildings left behind. These cultures poured all their resources into creating a spectacle that lent credence to the myths of their leaders, a myth that deceived the populace into trusting priests and kings who devoured their children. The same story is captured in the text of Exodus. The Pharaoh, who forgot the name of Joseph, began to exploit the labor of the Hebrews to build cities to his glory. Rather than inquiring or observing why the Israelites bore strong, healthy babies, in contrast with his own people, he sought their elimination through genocide. These cultures had lost the kernel of the way, and in their desperate attempts to hold on to life and culture, they erected the implements of their own destruction. For whoever would save his life will lose it. Almost every architectural marvel of the ancient world remains as corpses of cultural extinction. Even in America, our landscape is littered with empty 2- and 3-level shopping malls, the cultural meccas of the consumerist religion of the 80s and 90s. In light of this, we must reconsider the cathedral. Is the cathedral destined to a different fate than the pyramids of Egypt, the Roman Colosseum, or the ziggurats of Mexico? While I believe that Christianity is true, the cathedral is not an everlasting monument to the faith. Evidence suggests that cathedrals will continue to fade from the architectural landscape. What will replace them is yet to be seen, perhaps a return of the old gods. The construction of the Baps Swaminarayan Akshardham in Robbinsville, New Jersey, is a testament to the vitality of religious fervor in the 21st century. Though no humans will be sacrificed in the magnificent structure, its construction still signals an ominous return to the values of the old world. Over 12,000 artisans from India came to build the temple as volunteers, many of them members of the lowest caste in Hinduism. Footnote, there is a link where you can read about and see the largest Hindu temple being built in New Jersey. Others are building more temples of technology, like the Sphere in Las Vegas, or the increasing architecture of virtual spaces, which require the construction of bigger and bigger server farms, or increasingly massive distribution centers to reduce shipping times for consumer goods. Regardless of what these buildings are dedicated to, the continual interest in bigger and more spectacular buildings points to a bad end for our society. Much like Alexander's program of Hellenization or Rome's cult of empire, the telos of huge centralized projects requires the formation of people into machine-like cogs. The current trajectory of architecture and construction will terminate in one of two ways. Either the realities of the inflationary economy will bring the ever-expanding empires of the techno-capitalist religions to a screeching halt, forcing people to pick up the pieces and rebuild, or people will begin opting out of the current system of worship and find different ways to flourish. The foundations being laid. The buildings currently being built reflect the values and trends of our current society. Regarding the housing market, the trajectory is going towards larger homes for those who can afford them and rental units for those who cannot. The housing market reflects the values of the society. The focus on rental units mirrors the current trend towards young people remaining single and focusing on their careers longer before starting families. It also reflects the way more and more areas of personal ownership are being replaced by subscription-type services. It's a return to feudal serfdom, though one with multiple masters. Single-family homes are now a luxury commodity, reserved either for the high-earning, dual-income couples who can afford to start families, usually in their 30s, for retirees who have accumulated significant equity on older houses through inflation, and transplants from wealthier parts of the country. Here in the state of Texas, many of the larger 4- and 5-bedroom homes are being purchased by people from out of state, who are able to buy them in cash after selling much smaller homes on the West Coast. Because the profit margins are so much greater, many developers are focusing on building neighborhoods filled with these larger homes with various levels of quality and amenities. If they are not all true luxury homes, they certainly bear the appearance of success. Smaller single-family homes are still being built, but more and more of them are being purchased by large rental companies or being constructed specifically as rentals. At the neighborhood scale, many new communities are being developed around exclusive themes. The rising cost of homes are not all due to increasing square footage, but for access to a tailored experience. Gates and HOAs are the first line of defense in enforcing cultural conformity within neighborhoods. These barriers are not truly designed for safety, but to create class distinctions. Rules against how many cars a family can have parked or what they can and can't do to modify their homes restrict the utility of home ownership to those who are willing to participate in a very particular way of life. The specialization of community development does not stop there, as more and more communities are being designed to attract specific clientele or cater to a particular lifestyle. Age-restricted communities for retirees are becoming more common, while many others are functionally restricted to the retirement class, such as neighborhoods designed around golf courses. Others are centered around extravagant integrated amenities, with amusement park-level water slides and massive artificial lagoons. These communities are clearly designed with families in mind, but the architectural design informs us about what kind of families are valued by our culture. The three-bedroom houses are perfect for families who only intend to have one or two children. The maintenance services provided are geared towards the professional class buyers who aren't interested in spending their weekends working around their yard or home. At a larger scale, these neighborhoods are being built in a symbiotic relationship with ever increasing urban and suburban sprawl. Here in Texas, many of the new neighborhoods bear the suffix of ranch, indicating the prior use of the land being developed. Many of them retain some structure of the original homestead, a little dilapidated shack fenced off with a plaque bearing tribute to the family who first settled there. Former country roads are being turned into major thoroughfares to connect the outlying communities to the jobs in the city. And as the lanes are widened, they are being lined with restaurants and shopping centers. Whole towns are being engulfed by growing cities as ring roads of greater and greater circumference encircle formerly unique and charming communities into the urban monoculture. This is, of course, what is happening in a state that is successfully attracting new businesses to several large metropolises. Economic hotspots are often created by legislative action that gives incentives to certain industries and state investments into major infrastructures. Many areas of flyover country aren't booming nearly so much. For those who have the desire to create something new, there are still places in this country and many others with lots of opportunity to create and build industries, communities, and cultures that foster the best things in life. Traditional religions, modern economics, mainstream culture, and many other institutions insist on bounded set dynamics to control the outcome of communities. Rather than insisting on the old formulas of bounded sets, the internet provides an unprecedented opportunity for new communities to emerge through centered sets. The desire to create, to build, to cultivate, and foster growth, not just in the realms of technology or science, but in relationships, families, and cultures as a whole, can cut across many other demographic categories. 5 or 10 families with a mix of entrepreneurs, craftsmen, teachers, and people devoted to hospitality can find many dilapidated towns to start something new. Who knows what could emerge from communities centered on the right goals?